Thank you, Hernan, for this powerful personal story. And speaking about stigma, this leads us to the final presentation. Welcome, by the way, Senator, to our event this evening. Senator Parker is going to talk to us about the benefit of erasing stigma.
Good evening, how's everyone?
Great.
Is awake? Good evening, how's everybody? Good. Again, I'm State Senator Kevin Parker. I represent the 21st District in Brooklyn, which is Flatbush and East Flatbush, Midwood, Ditmans Park, Kensington, Windsor Terrace, and Park Slope. You got some Brooklyn people here? Yes, there we go. Brooklyn's always in the house, no matter where you go. I'm giving lectures across the world, and there's always somebody from Brooklyn, like way in the back, like, hey, I'm from Brooklyn. Give another round of applause. Hernan. Give him a round of applause, please. That was an incredible story, and really thank you so much for sharing and really doing it in a really articulate way that both not just narrated the story, but also gave some very serious self-analysis. It's clear that you've done some work to be at this place, and I would have never, if I passed you on the street and somebody told me that was your story, I would have never said that was your story. I would have told them they were lying. So it's incredible, and I'm glad that you continue to grow and share and help other people as they deal with these issues. I represent a very kind of interesting community in Brooklyn. Brooklyn, as you know, like New York City, like New York State, is very, very diverse and has all kinds of people. I represent probably the largest concentration of Caribbean immigrants outside the Caribbean in the world. I also represent the largest Pakistani community outside of Pakistan in the world. It's about almost 60% African descent, is about 10% Latino, 5% Asian. And we deal with a number of issues. As a member of the State Senate, I sit on a number of committees. I'm the ranking member in energy and telecommunications, but I also sit on finance and insurance and higher education. And so let me thank Yumna Khan for inviting me here today. She was a former intern of mine and a constituent, but then also a CUNY graduate, and I'm a CUNY product in aspiration myself, and I've been a professor at Brooklyn College actually for quite a long time. So it's this kind of programming fits in the line of the kind of important things that CUNY does or participates in. That's just really important for its students and for the surrounding community. We're here today as during the 65th anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the UN General Assembly, right? And these were a set of human rights that actually created on Franklin Delano Roosevelt, another great New Yorker, on his 4 freedoms, right? The freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of affair, and freedom of want, right? And it's really out of these declarations that at the time FDR was responding, and the UN was responding to the Nazi scourge, right? But that Nazi scourge is both real and physical, but it's also metaphorical in a lot of ways of dealing with the kind of tyranny that we and lack of tolerance that we find in our own communities. And to a certain degree, when we deal with the issues of mental illness, that's oftentimes what we're talking about. That people are afraid to address, the issues. And what I find, both in my work in my community and in Albany, is a lack of real understanding about the issues around mental health. We just really have not a really good understanding of what the different issues are, and in fact how you engage with them, right? And I'm talking about everything from things that is very severe, like schizophrenia, to things to the autism spectrum, right? And from people on the lowest end of the autism spectrum on up, right? We don't have a real good sense. One of the conversations I have a lot, because we have a lot of really good-hearted people as New Yorkers, is we talk a lot about poverty, and people always want to talk about homelessness, especially this time of the year when people want to feed and give coats and all other stuff, and they're like, we ought to find something, give money to these people. I'm like, the vast majority, I'm talking about literally 98% of the people who you see on the streets are not on the streets because they are poor. People are not in Florida. People on the streets because they don't have money. But in New York, we invest in every federal dollar that we can get as it relates to poverty. And so if you don't have money, we can always find a way to find you, food, clothing, shelter, and some safety, right? Only some safety, because as a New Yorker, we only got a certain level of safety. But, we have those kind of things. But mostly what we find in the streets of New York are people who are mentally ill. And well over 60% of them have diagnosed mental illness, and many of them are then self-medicating with drugs and/or alcohol. A staggering number of those people are actually U.S. combat vets. Staggering. I mean, it's just the numbers are actually embarrassing that we have allowed people who have given the ultimate sacrifice for this country and going to war to walk around not being treated. But and since particularly the incident with Creedmoor is a mental health facility out on the border of Long Island and Queens. We had a huge incident there 20, 30 years ago where we were essentially warehousing people at that point. And when people start talking about mental health services, unfortunately that is the thing that people think about the most is that kind of setting. It's being in some facility, being warehoused, and people not being properly taken care of. The models have changed a great deal, but we still don't do a great job at addressing those issues. And so there's two things I want to kind of do today. And so I'm here really more to be part of a conversation than I am to lecture to you about what needs to be done. Is that one, to talk a little bit about what can be done on the state level, right, and kind of what I do and how we can be engaged together to start addressing some of these issues. And then secondly, is kind of generally a call of action to what we all can be doing on every level to address some of these issues. I have two pieces of legislation that I want people to bring to people's attention. One is S1464, and S1464 is a bill that creates a chemical dependence and mental illness initiative to lift the cloud of stigma attached to military veterans over these issues, right? And what it actually physically does is that it actually creates a program that informs families about what the options are, particularly for vets. But then and part of what we need to do is educate the entire community. It's like, I always think about this. When I was young, I was raised in the 70s, right? And so there were gas lines and this was in conservation. Those things had to be very, very big. And I remember being a little kid and having to draw the conservation posters and Hootie the Owl and Don't Throw Paper on the Floor and all these other things, right? And recycling wasn't even around yet, but that was kind of the beginning of it. But we need to do that around mental illness. That we need to even with young people, but all the way to adulthood, teach people about the science of mental illness, of the things that people need to do in terms of addressing it, about the resources that are out there. Even adults don't know where the resources lie and how you in fact interact with them. And so part of what we do is we're trying to, what I'm doing in this bill, as 1464, is to kind of laser in on veterans and saying, okay, we know there's a specific set of conditions and syndromes that this population has, and let's start addressing those issues, and particularly around chemical dependence and drug addiction. And so we're hoping that we get that bill passed and that becomes law, and that becomes something that we start doing here in the state of New York, because we're not really doing enough. I have another bill that I'm really excited about, and I think that this is something that's really, really critical. We all have, if you're New Yorkers and especially if you take public transportation, have seen somebody who is clearly having a mental illness crisis, and where the police have shown up, and the police, there's a couple of 5, 10 of them, and they hopefully don't mace the person, but sometimes they do, or they have their batons out and they grab them, they wrestle the person to the floor. Right? We've seen this. Anybody not seen this? Right? That means you just probably got here recently. right? But we've all seen that, right? We don't have a proper way to respond. One of my favorite expressions. Let me take a quick tributary. One of my favorite expressions in the office is that when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? I'm constantly saying that to the staff, right? Yeah. I have a bunch of lawyers in the office, and they do everything's a legal problem, right? So like, every time we get something like we should sue the pants off. I'm like, okay, slow down, But the police are a blunt instrument, right? No disrespect to the police, but like the police do what the police do. Like for them, they are there to stop crime, and so when they get called, they treat everyone like a criminal. Someone going through a mental health crisis is not a criminal, right? They're going through a crisis, and they need to be responded to like they're going to a crisis, right? And be like, and we have two ways in terms of our emergency services to respond. We know how to deal with sick people, and we know how to deal with criminals. That's it. If you're sick, God forbid, somebody has a heart attack or a stroke, we know what to do with that, right? The ambulance comes, and they do whatever ambulance people do. I know nothing about healthcare. They probably put a Band-Aid on it, but short of that, right? But they do what ambulance people do, right? Like the paramedics come, they take your vitals, so on and so forth, and they address you. And then again, if the police come, they lock you up, right? Like those are the two responses that our 311 system has to deal with people, who are going through crisis. We need to create, at minimum, a third alternative, because we do have so many people who need address in terms of mental illness. And so we have, through the work of some advocates in the mental health field, developed a bill that would create a crisis intervention team, right, or a CIT. And this notion would be one of two things. Initially, it would be to train both paramedics and police officers how to respond to someone who's going through a mental health crisis, but then eventually develop a team of specialized individuals that would come, whose only job would be to respond to these kind of crises, right? And so that if, God forbid, somebody was going through a crisis, that then somebody would be dispatched from a hospital, right? That would come and then start addressing these issues. And this bill is fairly new. We just started writing it. It doesn't have a bill number yet, but it's something that's certainly along the way on the drawing board, and will be something that we'll be taking up in the next legislative session, which starts on January 7th. And so those are kind of two ideas that I'm working on. There's obviously other things that some of my colleagues are working on, both in the Senate and the Assembly. But I can tell you now, although it ought to be, the governor is not talking about any of the issues as relates to mental health. But even on the issues of autism and autism spectral syndromes, there's not nearly enough conversation. We do in the State Assembly have a autism task force. We don't have such an entity in the Senate. I've done a package for the last 3 years in a row on addressing the issues of autism and autism spectral disorders. But we haven't been able to get any of the bills to the floor, right? And you would think that this is a population that should be, in our minds at least, sympathetic enough to be able to get a vote on some of these things, but it hasn't happened yet. And in part, it hasn't happened because nothing happens in Albany without action. Nothing just happens because it is the right thing to do, right? And the problem, again, with this community is that to a large degree, it's a voiceless community, right? And sometimes, literally, right? But I take that as a group that I work with in my former district, Shmakuleno, which means hear our voices. Is a Hebrew word. It means hear our voices. Jake, the guy who runs the organization, always says that we have to be the voice of the voiceless, right? And I never forget that. And we need to give voice to this issue in Albany, right? And so my call to action is today we must commit ourselves. And what I've come here today to do is not just share this charge with you, but to publicly commit myself to the issues of mental health and how we address them statewide. And like I said, it's going to be on a number of issues, but there's things that we need to do. The people here have to figure out what are the things they want to see get done. And they need to start addressing those things with their state legislators and their city council people and the governor and the mayor, and the new mayor coming in, and put these things on their agenda, right? And this becomes oftentimes very, very difficult because many times both the people who are going through the bouts with mental illness and trying to deal with it are not necessarily have a great deal of agency and are not necessarily politically incorporated at the level that they like to be, so that they can have agency for themselves. And their families most of the time are stunned, and they're many times dealing with these issues in very, very stressful dynamics outside, in addition to just trying to feed themselves and keep a roof on their heads and so on and so forth. And so it becomes difficult, but we need to figure out how do we in fact work with coalitions that are out there and make this a bigger part of the political agenda in both Albany and in the city. Because if not, we're going to be back here next year, and you'll call me back and I'll give you a slightly different speech, but it'll be the same speech, and we'll be talking about the same thing. Today is the time. Now is the time. We're now in the throes of mourning and remembering the life and the legacy of Nelson Mandela. I actually became an elected official because of Nelson Mandela. I was a student in the 80s, and I got involved went to Penn State University and got involved in the anti-apartheid movement and trying to protest Penn State to get them to divest from South Africa. And that was the first political activism I had ever engaged in my life. And it led not just for me and my classmates at Penn State, but it actually led to a movement around the country. And a lot of people don't talk about this. In the late 80s, you had about something like 30 or 40 campuses being taken over by students, including CUNY, around the issue of first divestiture and then about diversity on these campuses. And so you saw it at Penn State, at University of Penn, at Temple, like I said, City College. There was protests at NYU, Dartmouth, Kent State. I mean, there was, and kind of most famously, Howard University. And so I raised that because as we talk about Mandela, and so looking around this room, some are a little young and kind of really, really remember Mandela. He was admired so much because he took action despite great levels of danger to himself, right? And spent time in prison for that, and never stopped fighting for the cause that he felt was important. And so my charge today is for us, in our own way, to live the life and the legacy of Nelson Mandela, is to find the cause that is important to us and continue to fight every single day to make sure that justice is served in that cause. I want to thank you for this time. I'm looking forward to our conversation. I'm Senator Kevin Parker, and you are the resistance.
Good evening. I'm a student here at John Jay. My name is Landy Familia. I have a question for the young man here. There is substantial evidence about the community advocacy as opposed to medical problem, and as how it's worked so well with the youth. Has there been any evidence with working with a much older population with mental illnesses or complex illnesses such as Alzheimer's or dementia, things like that?
Has community advocacy that's demonstrated, so community advocacy has demonstrated effectiveness when it comes to young men who have not yet been incarcerated formally as a diversion project, right? Survivors of intimate partner violence and young women involved in the juvenile justice system. No study has yet taken that model and translated it to an older population. I'm not sure what setting you might be thinking of, but certainly there are complex mental health needs that come at the intersections of people as they reach later life issues. But I'm so glad that you asked that question, because it is the type of model that lends itself to extension to so many different types of populations. So there isn't evidence for it yet, but I bet there is work to be done in that area, certainly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, good evening. My name's Umair. I work for Senator Parker. My question is for you.
Depending on what the question is.
Yes.
is that what would be the clinical diagnoses for the participants in your program? And how would you juxtapose what you're doing with the counseling vehicles that are being offered now to these juvenile members of whatever program that they're in, and then consequently also what costs are associated with what you're doing as opposed to what the traditional method is in dealing with these populations. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for your question. So we know for a fact, because we actually, though we don't rely on diagnoses, we actually do engage in some mental health diagnostic work, and specifically we have all of our participants complete the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Survey. And so we know that the participants going through this program are more than likely to be diagnosed, first of all, with more than one mental health disorder. Most often conduct disorder, which is a more extreme form of oppositional defiance disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder, especially when you are talking about older, like youth who are 15 or 16 and older who have at least witnessed community violence, if not been on the forefronts of experiencing community violence, and or have been survivors of rape and sexual assault oftentimes. And then also depression and anxiety. And I think that, the high rates of suicidality, as alluded to also by our second speaker, sort of talks about how this is not just an issue of anger and violence. This is an issue of very complicated intersecting mental health needs. So the average number of diagnoses for kids who become incarcerated in juvenile justice across the nation is 5. They are diagnosed with, on average, 5 different mental health disorders. And those are the most common 5, the ones that I mentioned. Regarding your second question, was around, your third question was around the costs associated with them. Your second question was around what it would take.
Well, juxtaposing that with current counseling programs, like what's different about...
Like what services they're receiving now.
Right, what's different between the resiliency that or the advocacy that you're offering versus the traditional service that they would get through counseling?
Oh yes, I think you can pretty much take say your first name again, I'm so sorry. Hernan. What Hernan was talking about when they're within the facilities, it's medication. There are certainly caseworkers and counselors, but the sessions are very short, they're non-mandatory, and they're mostly for monitoring of medication side effects. That's what we see within the facilities for sure. And I can say that I've been in facilities in Oakland, California, Chicago, Illinois, and New York City here. And that's been a common thread, a common theme. And another huge difference is, let's say that youth are receiving therapy. Let's say that they have someone within the facility or even outside the facility to talk with that they have a good relationship with, right? One very huge difference between advocacy and even having a therapist who you bond with is that the youth are expected to go to the therapist. The youth are expected to figure out somehow how insurance is going to cover that session. And on top of that, the youth are the ones that have to demonstrate, let's say to their probation officers, that they in fact are completing that therapy. In advocacy, we take all of that and we say, we come to you, we know that you need to, that this is a requirement of your probation. We've already got the paperwork filled out for you, but we're going to tell you why it's important, and we're going to make sure you know how to do it in case there's a next time, right? And there is no record, there's no insurance at all to deal with. And so whether the youth want diagnoses on record or not, it doesn't matter. And because we understand the complex needs of those youth, we fold all of those different things into it. It's really about how can we set up this child to succeed in an individualized way, as opposed to what's the most effective treatment for disruptive behavior disorders, and come to my clinic and get that treatment, you know? But we also are informed about what is effective about disruptive behavior disorders. Doesn't exclude that. We're very research driven. And then in terms of cost, at minimum, in most facilities, it costs $75 a day to house a youth. And what it takes to run an advocacy program like this, if you didn't evaluate it, is something much closer to $100 per youth for the entire program. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good evening. Thank you to the professor, the senator, and Hernan. My name is Afrodita Haka, and I work for the Center for International Human Rights. On the eve of Mandela's departing, I think it's interesting how the senator mentions the views of a great leader, and that changed so many different perceptions around the world. Mandela stood for humbleness and humanity, and I think at the core of many mental health issues, there is this lack of understanding, as the senator mentions, and a lack of willing to address issues until they hit home, you know, until there is like a mass killing, or, you know, Sandy Hook happened this time last year, or until it addresses your own family and it hits home. But mental health has affected everyone in a different way or another, whether it's biological or environmental. There are different levels for mental health, and the stigma behind mental health is negative in so many ways, but the actuality is that so many human beings personally have their own mental health issues that they go through in their life. And our culture really is not welcoming of problems that are not quick fixes and that have a more difficult, deeper root to address. And they don't really know how to address them. So my question is, how do you balance different constituencies within America's culture and abroad to be on the same ground to address such complicated issues? And how do you get their support?
Is that for me?
Yeah.
I was afraid that. So, I am fond of saying about Albany that everything there is about three things: power, leverage, and control, right? That understanding the political system is not being afraid of power, leverage, and control. You have to understand it. Nobody does anything in politics because it's the right thing to do, right? We saw that with the recent sequester and the walkout, the shutting down of government, right? So it's about power, leverage, and control. And so, again, I'm speaking to, there's several different layers in which we have to kind of organize ourselves, but I'm certain it's clear to me that we certainly need the government to be engaged, right? I'm not a person who believes that what's good for, GM is good for America, right? In fact, government is just the opposite. Government is actually created to do the things that the market can't withstand. If there was a market to taking care and addressing the needs of people, with mental illness, then there would be large corporations doing it right this second. We wouldn't need to have this conversation, right? Everybody's mental health needs would be being satisfied, right? So you need government to kind of step in because no one else is doing it. To get government to do anything, you need to have power, leverage, and control. We're in college, so let me just give you a quick political science lessons, right? So Max Weber, right? Spelled Weber, pronounced Weber, German sociologist, says that power is the acquisition, use, and maintenance of power, right? Right. Politics is the acquisition, use, maintenance of power. Power is the ability of a group to realize its social will, even in opposition to others, right? And so what that means is that you understand power as a social dynamic. And so it's not about what individually people do here, what you do, Doc, in whatever your capacity that you work in, but it's really about how we can, in fact, pull ourselves together as a social group to in fact CNN. So people who are concerned about these issues have to band together and develop a plan and run campaigns to in fact make the government respond to your demands, right? That's the broad strokes, right? Specifically, you need to do three things. One, start developing groups either here at the university and around the city and the state, and there are already some coalitions and groups already working, start organizing those folks together, figure out what resources that you have, and start making some demands. Right now, there ought to be some conversations about who's going to be the head of the New York City Department of Mental Health. Who's your candidate for that? I think you should take the job, but we'll see. We'll talk afterwards. But we need to, but like that's part of the conversation, right? Bill de Blasio is going to have to find out, is going to have to appoint a new New York City, a new commissioner of the New York City Department of Mental Health. Who is that person? Is the advocacy committee, community talking about that and putting forward the person they think is going to best address their issues, right? And then beyond that, it's working with city council members, working with this new commissioner to see a set of protocols done. What's your agenda? What are the 3 or 4 things you want to see done this year? And the same thing on the state level, right? So that's the first piece, to have an agenda and start addressing the political establishment. The second part is public discourse. And there really has to be a public discourse. And Herman, I think I'm just so overly impressed because, he's the kind of representative, we need to, get him everywhere, telling his story, right? Because this is, unfortunately, his story is not as uncommon as we like to pretend. Now, not everybody can articulate it in the way that he can, but there's a lot of young people going through what this brother's gone through. And we need to, in fact, tell that story and get people to understand that these are our young people that we're talking about. And that we're not addressing their needs, right? And so there has to be some public discourse. Lastly, we need to do education, and it needs to be everyday education for an ongoing thing of educating people, educating our communities. And again, more forums like these, more conversations in our communities, about these things. Every time you want to put a facility that deals with mental health needs in a community, it's a huge issue in the community boards. Huge. Nobody wants it. Meanwhile, the people in your community have mental health needs that are not being addressed. But you can't say that to anybody because everybody pretends, as you indicated, that that's somebody else's problem. Right? When the reality is, it's everybody's problem. Right? And so that's my suggestion for the 3 things that need to be done to affect. And I hope that answers your question.
Yes.
Okay.
Good evening. My name is Hisham, and I'm actually a senior here at John Jay, and also a member of the Armed Forces. And my question is directed towards Senator Parker. I know you also made a reference to the military, and I actually returned from deployment in October 2012 from Afghanistan, and I lost a lot of close friends out there. And as difficult as this is for me, being a team leader, and somebody who has to be turned to when families have nobody else to turn to, when it comes to helping individuals in the armed forces with mental health issues, how do we help the families that literally have nobody else to turn to? Because I can honestly say 100% of them have turned to me, at least from the individuals that I've lost. And I'm sorry, this is a little difficult for me.
Take your time.
They blame the government for everything, and that they're not being proactive, they're not doing their job, and I've heard it all. And in your personal perspective, Senator, how do you feel that we can reach out to our community and work together so we can help the families that have endured loss and give them closure and comfort?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for your question, but mostly thank you for your service to all of us. You're right, and this is one of the things I think, I always say that we care more about the wars than we do about the warriors. And we even do even less for their families. I think that there is, again, I have a bill that I talked about that's S1664, which in part deals specifically with the issues around, because I was talking about that because it deals with the issues of chemical dependence and substance abuse, exactly because that becomes it's not really the problem, but it becomes a thing that we can identify, that we can start treating to help as an access point to the underlying problems, right? We need to do better in terms of government response. And even though the vast majority of people who belong to the armed forces, the civil service men and women, mostly on the federal level, when they return home, they actually then become the responsibility of the state, right? So over the next 2 years, and people may be surprised to hear this because of the ending of the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, to the degree that they are ending, there's going to be about 2 million veterans returning home in the next 2 years. 2 million. New York State in the next 2 years is going to get about 45,000 vets back to the state of New York. And we're not prepared. We have no idea what we're going to do with all these folks. And I'm talking about everything from housing to jobs to, and people are coming back with, mental health issues. They're coming back with chemical dependency and substance abuse. And we're not prepared to deal with those things. And so that's been part of the conversation that we are engaged on the state level. Now, to the credit of the governor is putting together in the middle of this month a task force, not a task force, I apologize. What is it? It's I think a roundtable. I know they're doing like a 1 or 2 day conference on the issue in the middle of this month to start talking about some of those things. And so I'd love to connect with you afterwards. And so we could be in touch and start figuring out some of the specific things that the New York State Department of Veteran Affairs can be doing to both address the issue of veterans, but also to the issues of their families, because you're absolutely right. I think that most of the services that we do offer on the state level are to veterans themselves, but not much at all to their families, and we need to figure those things out, and again, particularly around these types of issues.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. Okay.
Thank you very much for your speeches. I am Despina Glaru. I'm teaching human rights law in Freie Universität Berlin. To you first, may I sit because it's not. Yeah,
yes.
It sounds like a great program and a great initiative, but as you mentioned, why is not so extended as you said? And secondly, I wanted also to ask you, you said in the presentation that it's also run by students. They are not professionals, so do they receive specific training or? And if I may, to Hernan, thank you so much for sharing this with us, your experience. From all of your experience, what you would propose? What is the gist that you would propose to people from your gut, let's say, to do? What would you say directly? Thank you.
Your call.
I'll just answer that question.
Go for it.
To the extent possible in terms of what can be done, there are a lot of things right now currently in New York State happening, and a lot of the conversation revolves about how do we include young people. I've had conversations with members of my gang in the past, who have essentially wanted to make a drastic change in their lives, but the surrounding environment doesn't allow for that. And there's a lot of models out there that revolve around, youth voice, youth engagement, actually working with, the community and working with law enforcement as well. Basically getting everybody together at the table and sitting down with young people. That would be the ideal way to go. Collaboration, for the most part, we all, the law enforcement has their own thing. As the senator mentioned, they do their own thing for the most part, just in general. and then community-based organizations at the same time, they do their own thing, trying to offer services as best as they can. And the community in general, at times, is not very it's active in a lot of the issues that are going on, and it really takes getting everybody together, law enforcement, community, and those who have been in the system, to sit there. It could be in a public hearing, it can be just in a small room here at John Jay, having a discussion and getting that feedback. But you really need to sit people together and start these conversations. A lot of, what the Senator just mentioned in terms of putting a face to a story. We can talk about the statistics, we can talk about, anything that's happening, but unless we put a face to it, it really shows no value to, that work. So that's what I would recommend in general, just getting collaboration from all parties.
Sorry.
Oh,
Yes.
sorry, yes. It was a three-parter. Regarding your first question, why is a model that demonstrates effectiveness not disseminated to the extent that we would maybe like it to be? I think that, just to give the short answer to your question, I would say that there are some existential reasons for it, and then there are some logistical reasons for it. And I think that the philosophical existential kinds of reasons for it is because it requires, even though it might not seem radical, it really requires a radical shift in the way that we treat people who we see as, not our problem, as mentally ill, and how we define the problem of mental illness. So to say that mental illness is not a symptom that can be located and assessed within a person, but instead is a product of lack of access to opportunity and resources, and therefore is a problem located in the context, requires that we change the context, requires that we change the systems that respond to mental health. And that means we have to admit our own responsibility in maintaining the status quo, the system that systematically disenfranchises and disadvantages many, many vulnerable populations, right? So that's sort of the existential level. I think that is a tough thing to do, and it requires lots of education, lots of open discussion and dialogue. And then on the logistical level, it's simply not a model that is that fits with insurance companies.
Mm-hmm.
So for many reasons that we can talk about the specifics of later, but that's just a big issue. Yes. Your second question regarding the paraprofessional training. Yes, our advocates are paraprofessionals. They're advanced undergraduate and early career graduate, sort of master's students. And what they get is incredible training. And the training is manualized. So yes, they get an intensive 10-week training. They must sort of be up to par in order to be able to go out and be in the community as advocates, absolutely. And they receive individualized supervision. So the same level of individualized care that we give to each individual girl in the program is given to each of the paraprofessional advocates who are in the program as well. And that's where sort of parts of the model become sort of powerful to think about, because each advocate is being trained to rethink about how we deliver mental health services. And if they go, and wherever they go and work, and they take part of that model with them, there are the potential for those ripple effects to occur. And at the same time, it would be wonderful to have something systematic where this actually is happening in a more widespread way that we are actually also evaluating as well. Sure.
Last question. Okay.
Hi, my name is Catherine Escona. I'm a student at John Jay. I'm also an assistant for the Center for Human Rights. My question is for you. You mentioned that these paraprofessionals are undergraduates. How could a college as John Jay be involved in something like this?
Yeah, great question. Lots of different ways. So two of the most popular ways in which undergraduates become involved are through the creation of essentially field work or service learning courses that you take for credit. So it's not some volunteer community service thing that you do on the side. It's actual credit that you get towards your degree. And it would be a year-long course that you take, and you would get the training in the first part of the course, and the rest of the course would be you serving at least 2 advocacy clients. This is the way that we've done it so far in Chicago, for example. And then of course there are alternatives to that depending on what would fit best for your university's needs. So there is, because this relies on university community partnerships and really leverages the resources of universities, students being among the most incredible, valuable resources that universities, there are ways in which we can think about how students can become involved so that there is actually a Roses or some alternative for a different population of advocacy housed within John Jay, structurally supported by John Jay, and perhaps evaluated through a centralized system so that doesn't fall on, that never falls on the actual advocates to evaluate the program. So the short answer to your question is there's lots of ways and there's lots of different models, and every single time we've tried to implement this at a different university, it has worked, and we have adapted it to meet certain specific requirements, to make it something that's actually appealing for students instead of something that's added that is potentially burdensome. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of the session. Before I thank our participants and all of you for being here, I want to make just a quick comment. I said at the beginning of the remarks that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is an instrument that is imbued by the spirit of inclusiveness. And of course, as we know, in the human rights field, tremendous challenges remain. In fact, as I say to my students, the reason that we use the human rights language is because human wrongs continue. Mm-hmm. And a lot of human wrongs. And days like this, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights anniversary, is an opportunity both to think on the achievements that have achieved, so that we have reached, but also some of the challenges that remain ahead. And one of the reasons that we wanted to get involved with the mental health issue, which is the theme that we're working this year, is because formidable challenges have only begun the conversation. And in this effort on how to try to advance a human rights sensitive approach, one of the things that struck today in one of the presentations by Hernan, who gave a very powerful personal story, is the moment where he was discussing about what changed his life, that he was confronted by a professor who for the first time did not use one of the facile labels to which he was exposed, that is juvenile delinquent or gang member, but addressed him as Hernan. And from my experience with human rights advocacy in other areas, the most difficult and tricky thing, although you are never guaranteed success even if you do that right, but this is a very important first step, is what is your entry point in the conversation and engagement with others. And what I find interesting about your comment was that sometimes it's as simple as address somebody in a way that reflects their inherent dignity. And that was what I think. I don't know if it was a John Jay College professor or somebody else, but whoever it is, this was exactly in the spirit of what we're trying to celebrate today. That you are Hernan, you are not a gang member, you are not a juvenile delinquent. This is the beginning of an engagement that can hopefully lead to some human rights sensitive outcomes. Anyhow, these were just some quick thoughts. I very much hope that you will join me in thanking our speakers tonight, Sabnam, the Senator, Hernan, for addressing from different perspectives a very critical issue area. I also want to take this opportunity to thank our partners in this effort this year, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, the campus at John Jay, who has been a partner from the very beginning in trying to address and engage our college community in this critical issue area. And to tell you that our conversation on this issue continues next semester, and I would like to briefly highlight two events that we would like you to mark on your calendars, but also please sign the sheet there so that we can put you on our listserv and update you on these events. The one is our event on International Women's Day on March 8 that we're going to focus on gender-sensitive interventions in the mental health area in celebration of International Women's Day. And then on April 17th, a colleague of us from William Patterson University, Gina Guerrieri, is working on a documentary on mental illness, in particular focusing on depression. And we are going to show this documentary here, and then we're going to have a panel of experts discussing it. So very much hope that you can join us in this continued conversation. Thanks again to our speakers, and thanks for all of you for being with us this evening, and happy holidays.